Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randy Baier, and we've got a bunch of interesting books. I'm still struggling with the Trump election. And I finally found a way to understand it in terms of this book by Carol Anderson, who is the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor and Chair of the African American Studies Department at Emory University. And she wrote this book, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, White Rage.
White Rage.
And then she talks about how there is a cycle in this country that if black folks get an accomplishment, the white folks make them pay a penalty. That's the only thing that makes sense of how this election went. Because 20% of Trump's backers were really racist idiots, you know. And so she wrote about how, it started when she wrote about an op-ed piece for Washington Post about white rage at work. She said with so much attention on the flames, everyone had ignored the kindling.
Yeah, it's a good comment.
And she had been thinking about this since 1999, but she says since 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment, every time African Americans have made advances toward full participation in our democracy, white reaction, usually in the courts and legislatures, has fueled a deliberate and relentless rollback of their gains. And that really identifies what's happened with this election. The end of the Civil War and Reconstruction was greeted with the Black Codes and Jim Crow. The Great Migration North was physically opposed in many southern states, and blacks often found conditions in the North to be no better. The Supreme Court's landmark 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision was met with the shutting down of public schools throughout the South, while taxpayer dollars financed segregated white private schools.
It happened in Northern Virginia, where I grew up. From I don't know the time I was 5 or 6 to graduating high school, but I grew up in a segregated school system, and even though in 1954 the law said you had to have a plan and a segregation plan, I was just reading this by some chance this year. I came across somebody's dissertation on the history of black education in Fairfax County, which is where I grew up as a kid. The original plan, which was defeated in the courts, it was appealed by the black educators, by a group of lawyers and black educators, was to take a 12-year plan to integrate the schools in Fairfax County, one class at a time, for 12 years. Sort of as if you're like learning, you're integrating a second language into a school system. You want everybody to learn a new language. And so it went to court. But even in my high school opened in 1962, and that's when they finally integrated the high schools in Fairfax County, 8 years.
This is the group. These and other historical flashpoints were carefully linked for social progress for African Americans, was carefully linked and countered by deliberate and cleverly crafted white opposition.
Deliberate again. But this one, it means purposeful as opposed to slow.
So she pulls back the veil, this long-covered punitive actions allegedly made in the name of protecting democracy, fiscal responsibility, or protection against fraud.
But this white rage is not confined to the South, right? It's not the legacy of Southern racism or of slavery per se.
But what's interesting, she points this pattern of white rage has gone on down through history. It's a defined pattern. And she says we need to reconstruct Reconstruction. What that all was. But I found it really helpful to have that kind of interpretation of what's going on about unequal treatment, and that it triggers off this irrational response, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. So this is one time that,
Well, she must trace the class system in this, the class, and try to make associations that go across racial barriers. But this white rage is not confined to the South, right? It's
Oh,
not
no.
it's not the
No.
legacy of Southern racism or of slavery per se. I mean, slavery, the slavery era that was predominantly.
well,
in
see,
the
white
South.
rage is the irrational response. And people across the whole country have that because they have the whites feel they have a right to their privilege,
Mhm.
and the blacks are trying to assert their right to be recognized.
Mhm.
And so when I read this, and I thought, well, nah, I think I finally understand what's going on, because otherwise it didn't make sense, you know. And the particularly peculiar situation that Hillary has gotten almost 3 million more votes than Trump did, but he got the Electoral College.
Yeah. 'Cause he won in the right states. Yeah. He won in those 4 big industrial states, Midwest, Rust Belt, whatever, Western Pennsylvania, and Michigan, of course, Ohio, Wisconsin.
But what's interesting, she points this pattern of white rage has gone on down through history. You know, it's a defined pattern. And she says we need to reconstruct Reconstruction. You know, what that all was. But I found it really helpful to have that kind of a interpretation of what's going on about unequal treatment, and that it triggers off this irrational response, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. So this is one time that,
Well, she must trace the class system in this, the class, and try to make associations that go across racial barriers and unify through class barriers, I would imagine, in some way.
well, she doesn't go to a Marxist.
No, but classes, I mean, isn't white
It
rage
isn't class,
heavily
it's-
involved? No, class is, sorry, not classist, but class is a marker of something that can bridge other gaps, other inequalities.
Not
And
really.
I wonder if she's trying to make that kind of association.
No,
you know.
she's just looking at it in more general
Because, you know,
dynamics.
well, the anger against the system is related to the system in a lot of ways, isn't it? By white populations, white working class populations. It's like where everybody's getting,
Well,
you
the
know,
black, well, what she's saying, this is the moment now when all of us, black, white, Latino, Native American, Asian American, must step out of the shadow of white rage, deny its power, understand its unseemly goals, and refuse to be seduced by its buzzwords, dog whistles, and sophistry. This is when we choose a different future.
Mhm.
But what helped me was looking at it as a cycle. That this is not new. That this is part of the.
No.
Because I had a lot of trouble with looking at the reality, you know, of having this overwhelming, you know, loss for the people supporting Hillary. And then you see, oh, I see what this is now. And along with that, there's some other interesting books here. One is Bill Ayers has come out with a new book called Demand the Impossible, a Radical Manifesto. And he says in an era defined by mass incarceration, endless war, economic crisis, catastrophic environmental destruction, and a political system offering more of the same. Radical social transformation has never been more urgent. So he's saying we've got to go ahead, got to do it, got to demand the impossible. So I thought that was also helpful. That there's a number of people commented on the book at the beginning, you know, give kind of little critiques. And a lot of them are really well-known authors.
Yeah.
Angela Davis says, for Bill Ayers, it's the freedom of our collective imagination that links the contemporary world, ensconced as it is in pervasive militarism, racist violence, and environmental devastation, to the flourishing of our planet. This is a manifesto that should be read by everyone who wants to believe that another world is possible. And that's hard to remember. Robin Kelly, you know, said that this is more than a book, more than a manifesto, it's a torch. Bill Ayers' vision for a humane future is incendiary. Fire that incinerates old logics and illuminates new paths. If we do not end the violence of militarism, materialism, caging, disposition, debt, want, ignorance, and global warming, our very survival is impossible. You know, so I think that's, and then in this chapter he's got teach freedom. I thought that's...
You interviewed him once. How does he do that? Yeah. You
He's very
interviewed
literate.
Bill Ayers in another book project earlier. How does he teach freedom?
Well, in this book, he's talking about the need to teach freedom, and about how when they tried to do that in Mississippi, it didn't go real well.
Yeah, no.
You know, and that the people of the Freedom Riders were trying to do that, and they are investigating the arson bombing of a church that hosted one of the schools, freedom schools, when they were arrested, jailed, released, kidnapped, and brutally lynched. So, you know, there's penalties to be paid, and the white rage is still very vivid. But I think the point is that that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try, you know, and to teach freedom anyway, even if people are reluctant and don't want to, because it goes against the grain. The obsessions that characterize too many classrooms, he says, today, especially urban classrooms and schools attended by the poor, are simple. The goals are obedience, standardization, conformity. The watchword is control. These schools are characterized by passivity and fatalism infused with anti-intellectualism, dishonesty, and irrelevance. They turn on the familiar technologies of constraint, ID cards, uniform dress codes and regulations, surveillance cameras, armed guards, metal detectors, random searches, and elaborate schemes for managing the fearsome, potentially unruly mob.
Yeah, it's getting to be like the 1984 aspect of yeah, it's getting to be like the 1984 aspect of that culture from that book, especially the surveillance aspect of it. The surveillance has become quite.
It's too easy to lapse into that.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't answer
Yeah,
the
because
question.
you can exploit the fear. I mean, I don't think that places should be unlit. It's not what I'm saying. I wouldn't claim that. I mean, there are dangerous places. You have to be
But still,
careful,
they're turning schools into, as he says, institutions of punishment.
yeah, right. That's what
With
it's like.
knotted system of rules, exhaustive machinery of schedules, clocks, and surveillance, the unesthetic physical spaces and the prison architecture, the laborious programs of regulating, indoctrinating, inspecting, disciplining, censuring, correcting, counting, appraising, assessing and judging, testing and grading.
The whole litany, right?
Because at our college, they're using the McGraw-Hill Connect program, which is all of it. Has nothing to do with writing, it has to do with just running the students
It's
through the
programmed.
process.
Yeah,
And the thing is, the students don't have the skills to use the computer program, they don't have the money to buy the books. It's a really a bad deal, but that they wouldn't be held accountable for the fourth one.
yeah,
But there's a number of students that never bought the books.
yeah.
They didn't agree with it, even if they did have them, they didn't know what to do with them. It says the system dehumanizes everyone. Our system of elite education manufactures young people who are smart, talented, driven, but also anxious, timid, and lost with little intellectual curiosity and a stunted sense of purpose, trapped in a bubble of privilege, heading meekly in the same direction, great at what they're doing, but have no idea why they're doing it.
Yeah,
And that is really true.
yeah. I mean, I think everybody has seen this, and, well, it's systemic at this point, I think.
Education for free people is powered by a particularly precious and fragile ideal. Every human being is of infinite and incalculable value, a better life.
Well, in his case, he's struggled, you know, he's a progressive radical who's struggled for the rights of many people and overturning a lot of our unfair laws for a long time. I mean, that's sort of his life's trajectory.
Here's an interesting story. Two young steelhead fish are happily swimming downstream when they pass an old crab sitting on a rock in the cool and beside the river. "How's the water?" asks the crab. The young fish look at one another blankly. What's water?
What's water? Yeah, yeah, that's great.
You know, what's the water's texture, temperature, chemical resonance, resistance?
That doesn't exist for a fish.
Because they live in the water, it's entirely taken for granted.
Yeah.
Because they can't quite imagine a non-watery world, they have a limited and distorted view of their own home. Time gives us life and kills us. And it's asking us to dive in, study, imagine, ask queer questions, read, learn, organize, talk to strangers, mobilize and display our ethical aspirations publicly.
Yeah.
And I think that really sums up the dilemma of ignorance and unreflective thinking. So, and then you talk about the American dream. The planet is as it is, a mass of contradictions and tragedies, rich with beauty and human accomplishment, vicious with human denial, an organism that drains us and replenishes us at the same time, gives us life and kills us. And it's asking us to dive in, study, imagine, ask queer questions, read, learn, organize, talk to strangers, mobilize and display our ethical aspirations publicly. So he says, choose life, choose possibility, choose rebellion and revolution, be a mensch, demand impossible. So that was an interesting thing. Demand impossible. So that was an interesting thing. And another book is Whatever Happened to Interracial Love by Kathleen Collins, and it was published posthumously. And it was put together by Elizabeth Alexander, who's an American poet, essayist, and playwright, and the inaugural Frederick Eisman Professor of Poetry and a Thomas E. Donnelly Professor of African American Studies at Yale. And playwright, filmmaker, civil rights activist, film editor, and educator. And she had put together a film, Losing Ground. It's Eisman Professor of Poetry. But what's interesting is the woman had died. And then
the author is a poet herself.
Kathleen Collins had died. She was a pioneer African American playwright, filmmaker, civil rights activist, film editor, and educator. And she had put together a film, Losing Ground, that is an extremely rare narrative portrayal of a black female intellectual. After she died, this Elizabeth Alexander ran across the film and worked to get it, to publish a work on it. And she said
The film that Collins wrote, and did
put
she write
together,
this?
she actually put together the film.
Mhm.
And it's an interesting thing in the sense that someone through scholarly research can identify someone who has a profound voice.
Mhm.
And that's what happened.
Mhm.
When she was reading, she ran across this work, and then she longed to see it, and this was right before they had streaming
Yeah, sure.
video, and then managed to see a copy of it, and then became committed toward working on a book about it, and this woman. She said, Kathleen Collins died too young, so in my searching I also sought for traces of the woman herself, one who I feel I know but wish I had known. Her voice is so bracing and her eyes so clear that I long anew, now that I've found her as a literary voice, for more of how she would have looked at the world. Unsparing but not cynically, analytically, humorously, a black, brilliant woman, intellectual, in a New York state of mind. And she talks about reading this book is about a book of short stories, and it's really remarkable. This one starts out, okay, it's a 6th-floor walk-up, 3 rooms, in the front bathtub in the kitchen, roaches on the walls, the cubbyhole of a john with a stained glass window, the light, they got light up there. It's the tallest building on the block facing, it's like someone's talking to, among each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite a voice.
Is the film a documentary that she did?
Yeah.
And is it interviews with people who are interracial couples? Or
Yeah.
interracial, because there was a famous case, well, it's now on PBS, and another movie has come out about it, the Loving case, which went to the Supreme Court.
The interracial couple.
But there's all these
Thought to
really
be-
interesting insights.
Right.
When she left home, she begins one story. When she left home for the summer, her hair was so short, her father wouldn't say goodbye.
Whoa.
This is African American.
Yeah, yeah.
He couldn't bear to look at her. She'd cut it so short, there wasn't any use straightening it, so it frizzed tight around her head
Mm-hmm.
and made her look in her father's world just like any other colored girl.
Mm-hmm.
She was on her way to Maine to summer school to speak nothing but French for 6 weeks.
Mm.
So, these tidbits of insight that are really interesting. But what I like is finding the voices in the culture around you because of scholarly literature,
Yeah, yeah.
and not giving in to ignorance. Here's a conference, parts 1 and 2. The right person. Charlie Jones? Yes, ma'am. You're a freedom writer? Yes, ma'am. They beat you up in Selma? Yes, ma'am. They beat you up with your light skin and your green eyes? How could they do that? Weren't you afraid? The South must be a terrible place. Did you hold hands and pray? Yes, ma'am. And they still beat you up? Yes, ma'am. It's the commonality of what you go through and struggle that is really interesting.
I see something on art here.
I thought you
Visualizing
might be
mathematics.
interested in-
Well, I'm interested in patterning and things like that. Tessellation, fractals, and this is on 3D printing, which is pretty interesting in terms of now 3D printing has gotten to the point where you can make remarkable objects.
They make car parts.
Yes, I know, you can get them on
See, I
demand.
just frankly don't understand that at all, how they can do that.
Well, I've seen 3D printing in action a few times. I've never seen these wonderful tessellated kind of tetrahedrons, cuboctahedron, something with an 8 in there, truncated cube, an octahedron, truncated octahedron, a rhombicubo octahedron. Fantastic. But they're, these mathematical structures that can now be plotted because of, 3D drawing and 3D planning. And
Well, they don't use ink, they use
no, it's
material.
plastic. It's a melted plastic that comes out of a jet, almost like an injector kind of a thing. It just shoots it out like a spider would shoot out a thread from its body. It shoots out a thin thread and does a layer at a time. So you're building in 3D. I've seen the printer, and it takes hours for the printer to do its thing because the plastic has to dry and stuff. So it divides up. It's almost like MRI in reverse. If you get a brain scan, not that I know a thing much about this, but the brain scan slices the image of your head into 25, 50 quote unquote slices of imagery. So it does the same thing, and it builds by slice. But the slices are minutely thin. I mean, they're hundredths of a millimeter
And then
thin.
it can compile.
Yeah, it just builds it right up. So if it's a circular structure, in some cases you've got, holes. You're going to have a place where it's empty coming up, and then it makes its it adheres to the next level. So you can make a circular thing, a spherical thing, or I watched. I was in Limerick for a conference in September 2015, and they had a maker fair, and they had a sort of a public art place where they were bringing people in. A lot of kids were there, and high school age kids, college kids, and young kids. They were training them in how to do computers and design, and they had built a whole replica of Limerick from, say, from old drawings from not that early, mid 20th century, let's say, for instance, of all the old streets and the old buildings. It almost looked like the hotels in Monopoly.
Well, thanks for being on Rip Rap again.
Well, it was fun. It was good. Yeah.